Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into some really thought-provoking material on the very concepts of government. Our mission, as always, is to navigate a stack of sources that don't just inform, but actively challenge our assumptions about how societies are ruled, and, crucially, how the U.S. government has actually functioned and evolved over time.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that we'll be looking beyond the common labels, trying to really understand the underlying power structures. We'll trace the historical forces that have shaped and will continue to shape our government. We'll start by clarifying some fundamental definitions of government types, and then, with those clearer lenses, apply them directly to the American experience, sort of connecting the dots through specific historical moments. It's a journey that reveals just how dynamic and often surprising these political structures can be.
Right. So if you think you know what kind of government we live in, maybe prepare for some genuine aha moments. Because at the heart of this deep dive, we're asking, is the United States truly a democracy, or is something else entirely at play? Let's kick things off with those foundational definitions our sources give us, starting with the familiar one. First up, democratic government, famously described as a government of the people, by the people, for the people. This could be a republic if the numbers are too large for direct meeting. Sounds pretty ideal, right?
It does sound ideal. But then, right away, we have to consider what our sources call oligarchic governments. These are controlled not by all the people, but by only part of the population. Now, that controlling part can be large or small, and it takes different forms. For instance, it's an aristocracy when membership is by birth, inherited power.
Okay, aristocracy by birth.
But when that membership is determined primarily by income and wealth, our sources call it a plutocracy. And this raises a really important question straight away. How much influence does wealth truly have in our system today? And, how might that label apply?
Plutocracy through wealth, okay? And then completing the spectrum.
At the other end, we have autocratic government. This is where a single individual, a family, or a very small, unchallenged group holds all the power.
Right, and the sources remind us, historically, autocracies have actually been the norm, haven't they?
Yeah, that's the really striking part. For most of recorded history, from Roman emperors to Western European kings, this was the dominant mode. Democracies, in comparison, were often pretty short-lived exceptions. Really only a few cases known before the Industrial Revolution.
It really puts our modern experience into perspective, makes you realize how maybe fragile democracy can be.
Exactly. So with those distinctions, democratic, oligarchic, autocratic, let's connect this to the bigger picture of the United States. Our sources argue that the conventional story, the U.S. is the first modern democracy breaking away from autocratic England. Well, it's actually quite misleading.
How so? Misleading?
Well, if we look closely, the reality of slavery, for example, profoundly shaped the nation's founding principles. It created an immediate and deep contradiction right at its core.
Ah, right. So forget the sort of polished narrative of the Constitution as purely democratic. Our sources reveal something much more complex, maybe even unsettling. They describe it as essentially a power-sharing arrangement, a deal between the democratic northern states and the oligarchic southern states. And this deal was explicitly crafted to preserve both representation and the institution of slavery.
Precisely. That's a foundational compromise that didn't just set a course. It baked in a fundamental instability, a contradiction, right into the heart of the nation.
Wow. So baked right in from the start.
And this initial compromise created a profound, lasting instability. While the Civil War certainly challenged it directly, the oligarchic organization of the South, particularly this idea of voting as a privilege, not a right, it persisted. It continued to echo.
Voting as a privilege, that's a key phrase.
It is. And a key insight from our sources is that this historical legacy, when combined with growing income inequality, has consistently pulled our government towards being more oligarchic than truly democratic.
So even after something as huge as the Civil War, that deep-seated structure, that idea of privilege just kind of endured.
It seems so, yes. That history of voting as a privilege isn't just a historical footnote. The sources argue it's a living legacy. It continues to pull our system towards oligarchy.
Okay, so with that in mind, our sources then trace a shift. They talk about moving from what was essentially an aristocracy in the South, where political control often rested with descendants of slave-owning families, to what they identify as a plutocracy now, where wealth dictates influence.
Exactly. There was perhaps a brief period, maybe something closer to democracy, during the middle-class expansion after World War II. But the sources suggest that didn't last very long.
And why didn't it last?
Well, part of it is our government's federalized nature. Delegating voting rules to individual states and localities. It means that deeply ingrained idea of voting as a privilege is just very slow to change. It keeps shaping who actually gets to participate.
Right, state-level control makes change difficult.
And this connects to the role of government itself. Our sources suggest that only in a truly functioning democracy will public policies actually be made for all the people.
Mm.
This is central to what they call the Lewis model and the investment theory of politics. Basically, the idea is that government policies are often heavily shaped by organized interest groups, not just the general public's will.
Okay, so a real democracy should be responsive to everyone.
Ideally, yes, it should act as a promoter of security and a reducer of risk, offering a kind of collective insurance against life's uncertainties, things like bankruptcy, illness, or old age.
And the U.S. government, the sources note, has sort of expanded this role in stages, right?
That's right, 3 broad stages. First, in the 19th century, security primarily for businesses, think limited liability, stable prices, bankruptcy laws.
Okay, business first.
Then, in the first half of the 20th century, a shift towards insurance for workers, things like workers' compensation, OSHA.
Right, worker protections.
And finally, since then, the aim has been more towards security for all. Examples like Social Security for old age, product liability laws for consumers, later extended by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and of course, Medicare and Medicaid for healthcare. These all fit this picture of the government acting as a risk reducer for its citizens.
Seems like a positive progression towards that security for all ideal.
It does. But the effectiveness of these programs, which are pretty crucial for a functioning democracy, often depends on the strength of that democracy. Take the Affordable Care Act's expansion of Medicaid, for example. The Supreme Court approved it, but with a critical caveat. It allowed states to opt out.
Ah, the opt-out clause.
Exactly. And many states, clustered predominantly in the South, chose to do so. Our sources argue this often reflected what they call racecraft, the strategic use of racial ideas to maintain power structures and justify policy choices.
So state control and these underlying biases could actually deny benefits.
Precisely, denying essential benefits to disadvantaged people. It's a stark contrast to that security for all ideal we just talked about.
And this brings us to that really powerful idea you mentioned from John Rawls, A Theory of Justice.
Yes. Rawls argued that the biggest risk we face in life, really, is being born into the wrong part of society, say, the low-wage sector, or maybe with a black or brown skin.
The family matching lottery, as he put it. That's such a striking phrase.
It is, and Rawls argued that a just, democratic society should actively work to reduce this inherent risk, to minimize the effects of this lottery. So the implication is, when our democracy weakens, this kind of crucial care, this reduction of fundamental life risks, gets restricted.
That makes sense. The less democratic, the less focus on mitigating those inherent inequalities.
And our sources provide some compelling evidence suggesting that the effectiveness of democracy has actually been decreasing, particularly since the initiation of what they call the American dual economy around 1971. This, they argue, has given way to a new oligarchy, or plutocracy.
And when did this become really visible?
Well, the process arguably became clearer in the 1990s. Our sources point to instances where political factions, maybe a determined minority, used institutional mechanisms like government shutdowns and impeachment. The argument is that these weren't just used as checks and balances, but maybe as tools to exert disproportionate power, pushing the system away from a broad democratic consensus.
Using the rules of the game to shift the balance of power.
Something like that. And if you thought those earlier shifts were significant,
Yeah.
our sources highlight a moment in the year 2000 that really changed perceptions, the presidential election.
Bush v. Gore.
Exactly. That election was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. The court took the very unusual step of banning further recounts, which essentially determined the presidency.
And the sources point out that Governor Jeb Bush, the candidate's brother, didn't recuse himself. And the court's decision, even though they said it wasn't precedent, well, it had a huge impact, didn't it? Including Bush later appointing 2 conservative justices.
It certainly raised serious questions about impartiality and the role of the judiciary in politics. And this brings up that fundamental question again. What about the right to vote itself? The bedrock of democracy.
Right, where does that fit in?
Well, consider the Shelby County v. Holder Supreme Court decision in 2013. It essentially gutted the most important part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It removed the federal oversight of restrictive state voting rules.
The pre-clearance part, yeah.
That's the one. So the very mechanism designed to ensure fair access to the vote gets weakened significantly. And what happened next? Our sources point out that, perhaps ironically, most of the new voting restrictions appeared in states that were part of the old Confederacy.
Echoes of racecraft again?
The sources suggest it reflects that persistent issue, yes,
Mm-hmm.
an echo from the past, continuing to shape access to democracy today.
And it wasn't just court decisions, right? There were organized efforts, too.
Absolutely. Beyond individual court decisions, our sources detail highly organized efforts to reshape the political landscape. Take the Republican State Leadership Committee, RSLC, and its REDMAP strategy after the 2010 elections.
REDMAP, I remember hearing about that. What was the strategy?
Well, they orchestrated a national effort to gerrymander districts, basically redrawing electoral boundaries to favor one party, using techniques like packing cramming opponents into a few districts and splitting opposition voters across many districts so they can't form a majority anywhere.
Packing and cracking.
Yeah.
Manipulating the map.
Right. And the result, according to the sources, in 2012, Democrats actually received about 1.4 million more votes for the House of Representatives nationwide. Yet Republicans won control of the chamber.
Wow. More votes, but less power because of the district lines.
Exactly. It sharply hampered the ability of Democratic voters to change leadership through the ballot box. It demonstrates how plutocratic influence perhaps can shape election outcomes even without winning the overall popular vote.
So the structure itself is being manipulated.
That's the argument. And add to that the shrinking middle class and the increasing influence of dark money in politics. The sources argue this means the oligarchy, the ruling group, is getting smaller and perhaps moving closer to an autocratic state.
Closer to autocracy. Is there a specific example of that trend?
A really dramatic example they point to is the Senate's refusal in 2016. They refused to even process President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. Unprecedented.
Right, holding the seat open.
Our sources present this as a clear breach of constitutional duty and a real risk of politicizing the Supreme Court in a way that threatens the basic structure of our government, that division of power between independent branches.
Undermining the checks and balances?
Potentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the financial influence behind these shifts isn't exactly subtle.
Yeah.
Our sources point out that the Coctopus, that network of conservative and libertarian organizations funded mainly by Charles and David Koch, spent over $40 million just on state-level races in the 2016 elections alone.
$40 million on state races.
Yes. And their preferred candidates generally won, keeping conservative governors and key congressional figures in place. It leads the sources to conclude, pretty starkly, whoever has the gold rules, suggesting we are potentially on a path towards an autocratic government where money effectively has the final say.
Whoever has the gold rules. That's a heavy conclusion.
It is. And it raises an important follow-up question. Could such a system, an autocratic state, actually appear without completely changing the outward form of our government?
Like keeping the appearance of democracy.
Exactly. Our sources end that thought with a powerful historical echo. They remind us that Augustus, the very first Roman emperor, famously kept the form of the Roman Republic intact. All the assemblies, the Senate, they still existed. But he held the absolute autocratic power behind that facade.
So the shell remains, but the substance changes entirely. That's a chilling thought.
It suggests that the appearance of democracy can remain, maybe even be quite convincing, even as autocratic power takes hold underneath.
So let's visualize that then. What does an autocratic government in the U.S. really look like if we strip away the pretense? Our sources encourage us to imagine one dominated by a very, very small group, maybe just a few politically active billionaires.
Right. Imagine a government making major policies essentially in secret, information tightly controlled by the leadership, perhaps similar to what the sources hint at with the autocratic operations around the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where key decisions were made with very limited transparency.
Okay, secrecy and tight control. What about policies?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, such a government would likely drastically reduce or even eliminate taxes on the wealthy and large corporations. Most government revenue would then have to be raised from the low-wage sector.
Shifting the tax burden downwards massively.
Yes. And government services would likely be cut back significantly. The regulatory agencies like the SEC, the EPA, the rules from Dodd-Frank, they'd either be starved of funding until they're ineffective or maybe eliminated altogether.
So deregulation on a huge scale. What about social programs?
Social Security and Medicare probably phase out over time. Medicaid and education would likely become entirely state-funded, which, given the tax cuts for the wealthy, would probably lead to their significant decline in many areas.
So the federal government would shrink dramatically.
It would restrict itself perhaps primarily to national defense, federal prisons, and the Federal Reserve for Monetary Policy, a very minimal framework.
Then what would life feel like in that system?
The sources suggest, for many, life could become somewhat anarchic, perhaps resembling a modern kleptocracy, like Putin's Russia is sometimes described. Corruption could become central, rewarding political friends, punishing or eliminating business competitors. Honest businesses might struggle.
And you mentioned prisons.
Yes, chillingly, autocracy often needs prisons to control the population. And our sources remind us the U.S. already has an exceptionally large prison population, one that looks more like autocratic systems than typical democratic ones. This makes such a potential shift less capital-intensive, you might say, than starting from scratch. The infrastructure for social control is already substantially in place.
That's quite a stark picture they paint.
It is indeed.
So you can really see how this deep dive into these concepts of government, democratic, oligarchic, autocratic reveals a much more complex and frankly evolving reality than the simple labels we usually use.
Absolutely. Understanding these distinctions and seeing how they might play out in American history, right from the founding compromises up to recent political maneuvers, it's crucial for being truly well-informed, isn't it?
It really challenges us to look beyond the surface, yeah.
And this journey through the sources, I think it highlights that democracy isn't some static thing we achieved. It's a dynamic struggle. It's constantly being shaped by economic inequality, by political decisions, and by these deeply ingrained social attitudes, like the racecraft concept we discussed.
Right, it's not a destination, it's an ongoing process.
Exactly. And it reminds us that knowledge like this is most valuable when we actually understand it and apply it. It encourages us to consider how these tendencies might continue to shape our future and maybe what role we all play in that.
So the final thought for you, the listener, to mull over is this. Ultimately, what does it mean for you when the effectiveness of the ordinary voter seems to decrease? How might a society where, as the sources bluntly put it, whoever has the gold rules impact your own security, your own well-being, and our collective future? We invite you to keep exploring these questions and consider what a truly government of the people, by the people, for the people would actually demand from all of us, right here, right now.